Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 77. The Most Uncomfortable Dinner. You sure I look okay? You look amazing, just as you always do. You sure? Yang asked, fiddling with the top button of her shirt. No creases or anything? Yang, Weiss interrupted, reaching up to remove her hand from the button. He is going to hate you regardless of how well pressed your shirt is. So just relax, okay? Real confidence inspiring. She sighed despite knowing it was true. But your mom will be there too. And she will like you regardless of how well pressed your shirt is. The heiress chuckled. Rolling her eyes and dropping her hands to her side, she let out a low breath and fastened the top button of her shirt. The day had been an awkward one to say the least. Before she had even crawled out of bed to do her morning exercise, her scroll had blown up with messages from numbers she didn't know, and it hadn't taken long to find out why. A quick search had revealed that the reporter from the day before had indeed published that she was part of the White Fan, and had not bothered to disclose most of their conversation, instead focusing on the attack on Shnee Tower 2 years prior, causing seemingly everyone to have an opinion. Someone even had so much of an opinion that they'd somehow dug up her number and released it, leading to her inbox being filled with horribly disgusting messages calling her all sorts of names. Fortunately, having suffered through the exact same thing in high school, she was well versed in ignoring them, and had quickly turned off the devices and continued with her day. Thankfully, there had been no real issues at college, as most of them had already known about her past due to other people from her high school attending there as well, but lunch had definitely been annoying. After getting out from her class and driving to Blake's house, she had been met by her best friend cleaning graffiti from the store's window. While most of it had been wiped away, she had definitely made out the word terrorist in what remained. Though she had been angry at first, Blake had been quick to calm her down and remind her that they had done the exact same thing in the past, and that she already called the police and handed over the security footage. She'd blown off the rest of her courses after that, choosing instead to stay at the store and help Blake clean the window, since it was her relationship with Weiss that had caused so much attention to be brought to the girls rejoining. Once it had all been washed away though, the two had returned to the apartment and wasted time until Weiss picked her up for dinner. It had felt good overall though, after all the falling out and arguing, to just be able to sit and laugh with her best friend again. Eventually though, after a long car ride with Weiss during which the woman had told her all about her day, which sounded just as awful due to having to be Jacques' assistant, and promised to get her one of the STC newest secure scroll numbers, they had arrived at the front doors to Shnee Manor. To say she was anxious about the dinner she was about to attend would be a bit of an understatement. While she knew there was nothing she could really do to win Jacques over and make him like her, Whitley's warning of how she could easily make things worse by antagonizing him was ringing in her head. And with her tendency to fight back when challenged, she was having to constantly remind herself to keep her temper in check. There was also the fact that it would be meeting Weiss' mom properly for the first time, and though the woman had seemed friendly enough before, that was before everyone knew she was part of an organization that had almost killed her daughter. No matter how far away from that faction she was, surely that association would be enough to make any mother worry for their child. So, even as Weiss reached up and knocked on the large blue doors, Yang did one last check to make sure her shirt and pants to make sure she looked as smart and respectable as she could. Before she could finish her check though, the door was pulled open and Klein stood in the opening with a massive smile on his face. "Mein Schneeflock," he said affectionately and held out his arms. With a smile of her own, Weiss quickly accepted the hug as she walked inside. "It's good to see you again." "Hello, Klein," she said with a glance to something Yang couldn't see. "I trust your vacation was good?" "Marvelous. Simply marvelous," the man said happily. "Baekyo is always so nice this time of year." "That it is." The girl smiled and held out her hand. "Well, now that you're back, I would like to introduce you to my girlfriend, Yang Xiaolong." "Girlfriend?" he said with a shocked expression, his acting skills surprisingly good. My. I leave for a week and so much has changed." "It's nice to meet you." Yang smiled at the man and held out a hand, playing along as there was clearly a reason he was pretending they hadn't met before. "The pleasure is mine, Mississippi," he said with a small bow. "Please come inside, and let me take your coat." Shrugging the dark brown jacket from her shoulders and handing it to the man, Yang walked through the doorway and into the atrium. Though it had only been a week since she was last in the massive room, she had completely forgotten how cold and depressing it was. Nothing but white and blue marble, with 15 feet tall statues of knights in armor and dull, lifeless paintings that had clearly been bought for their monetary value alone. Making it all the more cold, though, was the reason Klein had pretended not to know her. Jacques Schnee, standing to the side of the stairs with his arms behind his back, his ice-cold glare was trained directly on her. Unlike their previous meeting where he had given her nothing more than a snide glance, she seemed to have his undivided attention this time, and the knowledge of that fact sent a shiver down her spine that only grew worse as she looked into his eyes. Of all the Schnee blue eyes she had seen, Jacques were by far the coldest. While a deeper blue than everyone else's, there was no warmth in them whatsoever. There was no hint of kindness or compassion, but there was also no hint of hatred or cruelty. There was simply nothing. No emotion, no life, and absolutely no indication of what he was thinking. "Good afternoon, Father." Weiss's voice cut through the silence, holding no respect, but also no animosity. It seemed she too was hoping the night would end without issue. "You are late," he replied dully, his eyes not leaving Yang's. "There is a festival tonight, so the traffic dash." "What have I told you about excuses?" Though his eyes remained emotionless, his voice was like a whip crack across the silent hall. "I care not why you are late. Simply see that it does not happen again." Though Yang saw Weiss's hand curl into a fist behind her back, the heiress gave a small nod, and the man walked back to his office without another word. Taking her girlfriend's hand as she deflated and shook her head, Yang turned back to Klein and gave him a shake of her head. "Tonight looks like it's going to be hell." The man looked around before answering. "Just remember, Mississippi, he is the only one here tonight who does not approve of you," he said in a hushed tone. "Thanks." She smiled appreciatively, getting a happy nod in return. "Now," he continued in his normal, bubbly voice, "dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. I shall leave you two to clean up and put this away." Giving her jacket, that was slung over his arm, a pat, he toddled off down the hallway and left them in each other's company. "I don't suppose it's too late to cancel now, is it?" she asked weakly, receiving a soft chuckle from the beautiful woman. "I wish," the woman breathed, turning around to place a hand on her chest. "Come on. We can go to my room while we wait." "Wine, miss?" the servant asked, holding the bottle out towards her glass. "No, thank you," she replied politely. "Water's fine." As the women walked away, Yang looked up at her host and saw him watching her with interest. That look had been on his face since the moment she had entered the room and sat down, and had only become more excited while they all waited silently for the food to be placed in front of them. Even Willow and Whitley were both quiet, choosing to look down at their plates instead, and Yang took that as an indicator that both of them knew what was going to happen. Thankfully, as much as she was not looking forward to the questions that she knew for sure were about to come her way, at least the food looked like it would be pretty good. And considering what it was, it had better be. Though she had never personally had the biggest interest in fish, Blake was, and since she liked to cook food that her best friend liked, she had done quite a lot of research into sushi, tuna specifically. Because of that, she was more than familiar with how each one looked, and there was absolutely no mistaking that what had been placed in front of her was bluefin tuna, the most expensive fish in the world. Despite being only a thin sliver laid gently over the top of a mound of rice, she knew the tuna nigiri in front of her likely cost more than she would make in her entire life. Beside it was a few more pieces of sushi that she wasn't familiar with, and a few pots of different sauces. "It's been quite some time since we had a traditional Atlesian meal," Willow said with a smile. "You are in luck, Yang." Upon entering the dining room, Weiss had made a small show of introducing her to both her mother and brother, and though it felt appropriate having never truly met Willow, being introduced to Whitley and having him be polite and respectful was a little off-putting. Though it probably wasn't the best attitude, she actually quite liked the boy's usual frankness, and to see him act so completely unlike himself was something she didn't really want to see again, especially since she knew he was doing it out of fear. "Well, it definitely looks incredible, Mrs. Schnee," Yang replied politely. "I can't wait to get stuck in." "Neither can I," the older woman agreed and turned to her husband. "Shall we eat, dear?" Clearly unable to tell that the affection from his wife was insincere, or simply not caring that it was, the man gave a wave of his, and the other members of the family picked up their chopsticks. "So, Yang," Willow continued, as Jacques simply stared at her, "what is it that you do for a living? I'm assuming college?" "Yeah," she nodded. "I was working for a friend too, but they let me go so I could focus on studies. Oh, and what is it that you study? The arts, Yang said with a smile, happy to talk about something she was confident in, and even happier that Jacques hadn't spoken yet. Culinary arts, boxing, drawing. So 2 dead-end careers, and one that can be replaced with a microwave. Finally he spoke, and every head turned to face him. It was no longer a subtle tone, like he was trying to work her out, but a dismissive one. The same he had used when she had first met him. Well, this sushi looks very nice for having been done in a microwave, she replied before she could stop herself. Despite inwardly cursing herself, out of the corner of her eye she saw Weiss' head lowered to look at her lap, and a very obvious smirk on her lips. However, his daughter's amusement seemed to have gone unnoticed by Jacques, as the first emotion she had ever seen entered his eyes. Strangely enough, it wasn't anger as she had expected, but amusement. As if it was simply a game to him, which Yang was pretty sure it was, he picked up his own chopstick and began to eat his food. So, you're an artist? Willow asked, ignoring her husband. What are your preferences? Landscapes, mostly. Yang smiled at her, dipping one of the pieces of sushi in some sauce. I enjoy impressionist stuff too, but there's something about a beautiful vista that makes me want to recreate it. Interesting, the woman said thoughtfully. I recall seeing a small landscape of an Atlas forest on Weiss' bedside table the last time I was in her room. Was that yours? It was, Weiss replied for her as she had already taken a bite of her food. I spotted it the first day we met and loved it immediately. Well, it's a wonderfully drawn piece. You prefer pencil over paint, I assume? Yang hummed as she swallowed. Paint is nice, but I much prefer just being able to pick up a pencil and draw without having to spend an hour mixing paints. Plus, makes it easier to seize the moment when inspiration strikes. Of course, the woman chuckled. So is art something you wish to pursue in the future? Or do you favor one of your other courses more? Art would be great to break into, Yang acknowledged with a nod. But as Mr. Schnee pointed out, it's notoriously difficult to get anywhere in that profession. Same with boxing. That's why my dad had me take a more practical course alongside them. So cooking is where you see your future? Yang confirmed. I'd love to own a restaurant someday. Our family hails from Mistral, so I have plenty of ideas for a classical Mistralian-style restaurant. Interesting, the elder Schnee said, her voice sounding genuine. Well, I would love to try your food one day. Having explored quite a bit in my youth, Mistralian food was always one of my favorites. Well, if you ever stop by Weiss' apartment, I would be more than happy to cook some lunch. I just might take you up on that offer one day. Willow smiled and picked up some food from her plate. Silence fell again as they continued to eat their food, and Yang actually felt thankful that Jacques had remained mostly quiet. She was also thankful that Willow seemed to not think less of her due to what had been reported, or at the very least wasn't showing it. Unfortunately, as she was halfway through her meal, Jacques finally decided to speak again. So your father considers being a chef to be a more practical job? He said casually, as he pushed a piece of sushi around his plate. What is his profession? He's a postmaster, Yang replied stiffly. While they were still certainly having issues, she wasn't fond of people bad-mouthing her family. And your mother? Yang didn't reply straight away, thinking the answer through. Yang's mom is active. She's a courier. Yang cut Weiss off, the woman's head immediately swinging around to look at her in surprise. It definitely felt a little odd to openly refer to Raven as her mom. Though Summer would always be her mom, she wasn't exactly opposed to maybe using the same title for Raven. And while she certainly wasn't fully ready for that yet, having only been reacquainted for 2 months, she wasn't particularly keen on talking about Summer at a dinner that was already uncomfortable enough as it was. A postmaster and a courier? He asked with a knowing tone. Married? No, she replied. They separate just after I was born. With a small nod, he returned to his meal, and Yang felt a small buzzing on her leg. Carefully pulling the scroll from her pocket, she unlocked it and saw a message from Weiss light up on her screen. Stop trying to placate him. I want my family to like you for you. I don't care what he thinks. Looking up at her girlfriend, she saw the heiress giving her a soft, confident smile. Feeling a hint of warmth in her chest at just how little Weiss could stand seeing her act so unlike herself, she quickly typed back asking if the girl was sure. Almost immediately, the girl gave a nod, followed by another smile. Though she was still definitely hesitant, She returned it, and let her shoulders slump a little, her body immediately happy that she had stopped purposely keeping her posture so rigid. "So, father," Weiss said, and pocketed her scroll. "Has a decision been made about Rama no Tanjo?" The man's ice-cold eyes flicked over to his daughter impatiently. "Our decision remains the same as it did last year," he said bluntly. "Vale doesn't consider it a holiday, so neither shall we." "That's because Vale's council is all humans," Yang countered. "None of them understand what Rama no Tanjo means to Faunus." "Oh," he said with interest, an eyebrow raising as he surveyed her. "Then please, enlighten us?" Though Yang did in fact know what the holiday meant, having been confided in by Blake's family, she definitely wasn't going to tell Jacques. "It's not my story to tell," she said with a scowl. It was true. While most people understood that the holiday was a deeply personal one to Faunus, and a really big deal on Menagerie, that was all they knew. Its reason had never been written down, instead being passed down by families in speech alone, and very rare was it for a Faunus to tell it to a human. Even as a child though, Yang had known it was a holiday she wasn't entitled to know, and to never ask a Faunus about it. She had never even asked Blake about it despite them never having any boundaries. So when her best friend had revealed it to her one night completely unprompted, she had immediately sworn to never tell anyone else. Not even Ruby. "Well, forgive me," Jacques said with a wave of his hand. "But if they refuse to even tell us what it means, what reason do we have to take their word that it means anything? Should we do that for everyone who invents a holiday to take a day off as well?" Yang felt her blood boil at that statement. "Or maybe you should understand that there are some things you just aren't entitled to," she retorted. "Rama no Tanjo is a day for them to celebrate who they are. They shouldn't be stuck in a factory where they are mistreated simply for looking different." Silence fell over the table as Yang and Jacques once again stared at each other. However, this time there was nothing hidden as to what each felt. The animosity in the man's crystal blue eyes was open for everyone to see, and Yang knew hers were the same. "I'm not sure what lies the White Fang has been filling your head with, Miss Xiaolong, but I assure you that they are just that. Lies." Now, dear," Willow said, a slight tremble to her voice. "That is hardly an appropriate dinner conversation." "Well, considering we have one in our midst, I disagree." Both Willow and Whitley's eyes fell back to their dinner, as the man's gaze intensified. "Tell me, girl, when your friends were telling you falsehoods of how my facilities operate, did they happen to mention all the inspections and maintenance that those facilities undergo due to their constant sabotage?" "Yang hasn't been a part of the White Fang in years." Weiss jumped in to defend her. "And she was never involved in anything Li-dash." "Be quiet, child," the man snapped impatiently, and turned back to face her. "You expect me to believe that an ex-White Fang member simply happened upon my daughter and fell in love with her? From everything I know about you, no," Yang argued back. "You know nothing about me, girl," he snarled condescendingly. "But I know all I need to know about you. And if you think I will allow my daughter to continue endangering herself by being with you, you are very much mistaken." "I would never hurt Weiss," Yang fired back immediately. "And you expect me to believe that?" he growled loudly. "Your foul's friends have been attempting to take my family's life for years, and I will not dash." The loud clattering of metal on china rang throughout the room and cut him off. Looking to the side, she saw Willow had slammed her chopsticks against the plate and was glaring at Jacques with more intensity than even his eyes held. Even Weiss and Whitley were looking at her with surprised expressions. "That is enough, Jacques," she said firmly, her gaze steady as he turned on her. "I will not have such disgusting things discussed at the family table." If everything Weiss had told her was true, then it had likely been years since the woman had spoken to her husband like that, and it showed. Much like Weiss and Whitley, his eyes were widened in surprise, but his mouth was also still agape from the words that would never be finished. As if she had struck him, he simply blinked at her in disbelief, and Yang couldn't help but cheer inwardly for the woman. Unfortunately, as the seconds passed, the surprise faded from his eyes, to gradually be replaced with something darker and more menacing. Clearly noticing this herself, Willow immediately backtracked and looked down at her plate and picked her chopsticks back up. Fortunately though, whatever the look had been faded soon after, and with little more than a sneer in Yang's direction, Jacques returned to his food. Glancing over to her girlfriend, she saw Weiss send her mother a worried look and turned to see Whitley mimicking it, guilt washing over her, as she knew she had caused an argument that Willow would likely pay for later. So young, the older woman said, her voice trembling a little. I understand you have a sister? Sorry for making dinner uncomfortable. Even as she said it, Yang had to inwardly remark on how much of an understatement that was. It had been almost 30 minutes since they had left the dinner table, and almost 50 since the little dispute between her and Jacques, but she still felt a little frustration in her veins. Just the way in which he had been so dismissive of the Faunus holiday, even going so far as to say it was made up, had immediately put her on edge and removed any desire she had to try and be respectful to the man. After their argument, however, not much else had really been said between them. Instead, the man had mostly returned to his snide remarks and dirty looks. But that didn't mean the dinner had been any better. With every question Willow asked her, she had been very careful not to anger him with her response. As little as she cared about his opinion, she really didn't want to make things worse for Weiss's family than she already had. Thankfully, though, after 20 minutes, the dinner had ended and she and Weiss had left the room, eventually finding themselves tucked away on a couch in the library while Weiss studied for an upcoming test. There is nothing to apologize for, Willow replied kindly. It was quite refreshing to have someone challenge him in such a way. The woman had walked in a few minutes ago and began to scour the shelves. However, from how she had yet to pick up anything, Yang was pretty sure her searching was merely an excuse to stay. Still, she grumbled and let her fingers fiddle with a loop on her girlfriend's waistband. I probably just made things worse for you. I will handle Jacques, the woman said with a grimace. None of you should have to handle him in the first place, Weiss added bitterly as she scribbled on her notepad. Sadly, daughter, what is and what should be are rarely the same, Willow replied, a sad sigh leaving her as she shook her head. Yang could definitely agree with that. After all, having grown up with Blake at her side, and seeing everything the girl had gone through due to nothing more than how she was born, she'd had the same thought herself. She hated it, and wished things could be different, but so long as people like Jacques were the ones in power, she didn't see how that would ever be fixed. What is his deal anyway? She asked, hoping she wasn't overstepping. Was he always such a dick? She paused and scratched her head as Willow raised an eyebrow at her. Sorry. To her surprise, the woman gave a soft chuckle and shook her head. My father was a miner in his youth. Such colorful language is not new to me. As for Jacques, she turned back to the bookcase and ran a finger down a book. Even for me, that is a hard question to answer. The woman stayed quiet for a minute, but Yang could sense she wasn't done, so waited patiently. Finally, though, letting her finger fall away from the book, she let out a deep sigh and shook her head. Jacques' upbringing was not a normal one. The Gillies are an extremely old Elysian family, and their lineage stretches as far back as Atlas records themselves. Once upon a time, they were considered to be a noble family of such high regard that their word carried as much weight as the royal family themselves. But by the time Jacques came along, all of that was gone. Excessive extravagance, inbreeding, and a refusal to change with the times left their bank account empty, and their word meaningless. So, as Jacques' mother wasted her life away on drugs and men, he was forced to work and provide for his family. At 14, it fell to him to keep a roof over their heads, never having more than a bed to his name. His mother never bothered with him for anything but the rent, and he was so absorbed in studies to try and reclaim what he knew his family had once been that by the time he had entered Atlas his heart was already cold and distant. Her voice fell slightly, and her head hung low. Not that he ever let people see that side of him. Yang was uncertain how to respond. She knew all too well what it was like to be the one to keep a home together and to support a family, but at least her dad had still been someone who showed her love and affection after returning from rehab. From the sound of it, Jacques had neither, and having met Whitley and seen Weiss struggle to get him to open up, she could see just how much of an effect that could have on someone. Still, there was no sympathy for the man she had just had dinner with. I never knew any of that, Weiss said, having forgotten her work to listen to her mother's story with a scowl. No doubt by design. Willow hummed and finally pulled a book from the shelf, only to put it back. After Winter stumbled upon some old books in his study, he took greater care in hiding that part of his life. Of course he did, Weiss scoffed. I wonder why Winter never told me any of this. Your sister shares a lot of your father's traits, Willow remarked. His penchant for secrecy above all. Yang could hardly deny that. Though she and Winter had left each other on a better note, she was still rather annoyed about how the woman had treated Weiss. He cared enough to tutor her himself, after all. Before she could stop it, A snort of cold laughter forced its way from her throat. The idea that anyone could believe Jacques cared for his kids was laughable. No father who cared for his children would do what he did. No father would treat them with such contempt and beat them when they tried to live their own lives. However, to her surprise, Willow once again raised her eyebrow, but this time there was an air of disapproval in her gaze. "I understand your skepticism, Yang, and I hold no love for my husband," she said slowly. "But please do not be so foolish as to believe he does not care for his children. If you two wish to defy him and stay together, you would do well to realize that Jacques does not hold on to things he does not care for." For a few seconds, she met the older woman's eyes, and was taken aback by just how alike Winters they were. Both a cold and warmth laid within, neither more than the other, but the way in which she could see then turn from fire to ice was more than enough to make her feel like she was looking at Weiss' older sister. However, just like with Winter, she had to disagree with the woman's words. "If he cared, then he wouldn't be trying to stop her being happy," she said, and let her fingers entwine with Weiss. "As I said," the woman replied, turning back to the shelf and reaching up to a book on the topmost shelf. As she pulled it down, she saw what looked to be a video game console on the front of it. "What is, and what should be are rarely the same." She turned back around to give them a smile and waved the book slightly. "But you two should not be having to listen to the tired ramblings of an old woman all night," she said kindly. "I shall leave you to enjoy yourself. Good night." "Good night, Mom." "Night, Miss Schnee." Walking out of the room, she shut the door behind her and left them both in silence. "I think she liked you," Weiss chuckled, continuing to scrawl on her notepad. "I hope so." Yang smiled, wrapping an arm around the woman and pulling her onto her lap. "You really believe what she said about your dad, though?" To her surprise, Weiss didn't reply straight away. Instead, the writing stopped as the girl fell into thought. It didn't last long, though, and before long she gave a small shrug and continued with her work. "I suppose I do have some good memories with him," she admitted with a small amount of reluctance in her voice. "And it would explain why he never tried to arrange dates for me as he did with Winter." "Oh," Yang hummed. "Do those memories change anything?" "No." That answer was immediate. "A few faded memories change nothing." "Fair enough." Yang nodded and pulled the woman closer. Relaxing into the couch, Yang decided to let the silence continue so that Weiss could focus on her assignment. She still wasn't sure she could ever really believe that Jacques actually cared for his kids, and she didn't think she ever would, but she didn't care either. If he really cared, then he would realize that how he treated them was wrong. He would accept Weiss' decisions and not try to force his own on her. So, letting out a silent breath and returning to fiddling with Weiss' belt loop, she purged Jacques from her memory and buried her head into her girlfriend's neck to take in the comforting scent. After all, Jacques had pretty much declared he would be doing all he could to separate them, and she wanted to at least enjoy what she could before his plan went into full swing. Chapter 78, Mothers. Pulling the helmet free and shaking her head, Yang let out a small happy groan and leaned forward on her bike. It had been just over a week since she had first ridden her, and she still felt just as amazing as ever. The way the wind rippled through her hair as everything around her turned to a blur, how Bumblebee would respond to even her slightest touch, the vibrations that tore through her whole body. Everything about the newest addition to her life was pretty much perfect. And now she had been able to bring it home to Patch. However, as the last of the vibrations faded from her legs, she sat back up and clipped her helmet strap into the lock she'd installed and looked around her home. Patch had never really been much, especially compared to the sprawling kingdom it sat next to, but that was what she loved about it. Its tallest building was only 5 floors, and the only area that people could do shopping was the main square, but that simply contributed to the feeling of community that exuded from the island. Whereas in Vale, you would pass 1,000 people a day and not know a single one of them. Rare was the day you met a stranger in Patch. Everybody knew everybody, and everybody cared for each other like family. Yang could hardly count how many times a stranger had dropped by their house to deliver a pie they had made, or leftover food, or the amount of times she had done the same for her mom. But when she did remember those times, it was always a little painful. Despite living in Vale, and even above it as she currently did, for most of her life, Patch was always going to be her home, and leaving it had always been something she wasn't happy about. But even though she understood why her dad wanted to leave, she couldn't help but resent him slightly for pulling her away. "Hey, Yang!" The voice came from her beside her, and she looked up with a smile at one of her old neighbors, LYT. "Long time no see. How've you been?" "Not bad," she said politely to the girl whose hair was just as blonde as hers. "You?" "Bored mostly." The girl grinned. "I'm so jealous you get to live in this city. I can't wait till my birthday so I can get out of here." "Trust me." Yang chuckled in return. "You'll miss it when you're gone." "Please. There's only so much more I can take of being ordered around by my mom." The girl waved away her words. "But as soon as I get to Vacuo, it's gonna be nothing but me and the beach until semester starts." "Oh yeah. Your dad mentioned you got into shade. Hard to believe after all the shit you used to pull." "Heh." The girl shrugged mischievously. "What can I say? Smart and beautiful. I'm easy to forgive." Laughing slightly at the fact her forgiveness had more than likely come from the fact the teachers knew her parents, Yang simply nodded along and pointed down to the very heavy-looking bag she was carrying. "Clearly not to your mom." She grinned. "Aw yeah. I kinda snuck out last night, and she got super pissed." She let out a small sigh and swapped the hand she was holding it with. "So I could probably get it to her before she pops a gasket. Next time you're in town though, we should definitely catch up and talk about all the news I've heard about you." "Definitely." She smiled back genuinely. "I'll give you a message next time I have a spare afternoon." "Can't wait." "Laters." "Later." Shaking her head as the girl walked off, she kicked back the stand of her bike and stepped off the bike. As she did, she heard the familiar roar of another motorcycle ahead of her and watched as Raven pulled into another empty spot beside her, turning off her bike and shaking her mess of feathery hair free from her helmet. "Did you get lost?" she teased the older woman. "Or is Sleipnir too old to keep up with Bumblebee?" "You'll eat those words if we ever find ourselves on a straight." The woman laughed as she stepped off her bike and took a parcel from a box attached to the motorcycle's back. "She does run surprisingly well for being home-built though." "Surprisingly well?" Yang asked in false offense, popping open the seat and pulling one of the parcels. "She purrs like a kitten, thank you very much." A sly grin spread across the raven-haired woman's face as she reached out and took the package. "Her purr is fine. It's her roar that needs some work." "Ignore her, Bumblebee." She pouted and gently petted the back of her beautiful bike. "Thanks for giving me a hand with this though," Raven said, motioning towards a store across the road. "I'd still be delivering to Scarlatina if I was alone." "Yeah, saves you having to constantly go back and forth and waste fuel." Yang shrugged and put her hand in her pocket. "Besides, not like I had anything else to do today." "Why still at work?" Yang merely gave the woman a nod. Just as she had suspected, the retaliation for her behavior at dinner had been felt less than a few hours after. As they left the piano room, where Weiss had spent an hour trying to teach her how to play only for it to always end in laughter, Jock had descended upon them to inform Weiss that she was to be in work at 6 in the morning. Unfortunately, that also meant Weiss had spent the night at the mansion while Yang had returned to the apartment alone. And with the exception of a single text at lunch to say she wouldn't be home until late, that was the last she had seen of her girlfriend. Sadly, she knew it wasn't going to be the only time such a thing happened. So when Raven had called and asked if she wanted to help out and spend some time together, she had jumped at the chance to do something that wasn't just waiting in the empty apartment for Weiss to return. Plus, with her help, Raven would be finished cleaning up her boss' mess sooner, and that meant she would be less tired and grouchy. "Yup. And so is Ruby. And Blake." Yang let out a small sigh. "And pretty much all my other friends." "You miss it?" "Sorta," she replied honestly. "Mostly just miss working with Blake and having something to kill time with." "Could always have my job if you want?" "Fuck no." Yang scoffed and pushed open the door to the store so Raven could walk in. "I'm surprised you haven't punched him in the face already." "I do that, and I'm right back to jail." Raven laughed, though there was a slight edge to it. "Believe me, I asked my parole officer." "Well, I'd offer to do it for you, but with the amount of press following me around these days, there'll probably be 100 pictures that'll make the front page." "Probably best that we don't then." The older woman grinned and moved to the counter. "Parcel for Verdana. Needs her signature." "I'll grab her for ya. 1 second," the boy behind the register said, and took off into the back room. Inspecting the shelves as she waited for him to return, Yang grabbed a few bags of cookies that she knew Ruby would enjoy and placed them on the counter, as well as a strawberry muffin for herself. "So," Raven hummed cautiously, "are you nervous about tomorrow?" Raising an eyebrow in surprise, she looked up at her birth mother. "You sure you want to talk about that?" "Not really," she replied honestly, "but it's important to you and thought you might want to talk about it." "I do," Yang admitted, "but not if it makes you uncomfortable." Yang. Blood-red eyes met her own. "Me coming back to town is what led to you two having to do this. If you need to talk, then talk." Though she was tempted to turn down the offer and save an uncomfortable conversation with Raven, she was in fact rather nervous about the upcoming therapy session. Not only had she never really been a fan of therapy in general, but she was really worried about how things might change between her and her dad. While she hoped it would make it better, she knew that more than a few relationships fell apart because therapy made them reveal ugly truths that couldn't be taken back. Despite constantly arguing and fallout, that was at least better to her than nothing. She shrugged after a minute of thought. "I'm not sure I want to bring up our history all over again. It's not exactly happy father-daughter time as far as the eye can see." "I used to think like that," Raven hummed and leaned back against the counter. "When I went into prison and was ordered into therapy for my anger, the thing that made me the most cautious was having to relive my past." "And how did you deal with that?" "I didn't," the older woman shrugged. "Not for a whole year, at least. But then, I finally opened up and everything's got worse." Yang let out a groan. "Good Tal Dash." "And then, things got better." She looked to the side as the door opened and a woman in her late 60s walked out. "It took a while, but it helped me let go of some things and finally get to a point where I was able to come here." "You need my signature, dear?" Mrs. Green said, Raven giving a nod and pointing to the space on her sheet. "So you're saying it's going to be painful?" "That is exactly what I'm saying, yeah." Raven chuckled dryly. "But you'll come out the other side better for it. Not because your therapist is good, or because the issues aren't as big as you think, but because you want to." As the woman returned to sorting out the delivery, Yang dropped a few lean on the counter for her items and thought about what had just been said. Obviously, she wanted things to get better with her dad. It was the entire reason she was even willing to go to therapy in the first place. But the fact that she could potentially walk away from the sessions feeling differently still had her scared. "Besides," Raven chuckled and gave the signature a once-over, "it's not like it can be worse than that dinner last night." "I guess that's true." Yang sighed and picked up the bag. "Say, I know you, don't I?" Looking up at who was talking, she saw Mrs. Green looking at Raven with interest in her eyes. Raven, on the other hand, was pointedly avoiding her gaze. "Probably just seen me doing the rounds. Patch is a regular stop for me." "And no," the elderly woman said with a slight shake of her head, "I recognize those eyes." "We should probably get going, Yang," Raven said quickly, not acknowledging the woman and shoving the paper into her pocket. However, before they could even leave the counter, Mrs. Green's eye widened slightly in shock, and she leaned forward to peer at Raven closer. "You're that Brahmin girl who used to stay with the Roses," she explained, her face breaking out into a wide smile. "I'm sorry, lady, but you have me confused with someone else," Raven said, her eyes troubled as she stormed towards the door. "Yang, now!" At Raven's impatient voice, she cast an apologetic look towards Verdana and hurried after her birth mother. In the few months she had been getting to know Raven, she had never seen her flustered like that, not even at the party. She was frequently grouchy, and sometimes even a little angry, but never flustered. Fortunately, it wasn't hard to piece together what had caused it as she looked back and saw Mrs. Green pick up the wall-mounted phone beside the register. Patch was a small island, and Summer's parents still lived there, and given how much Raven tried to act as if Summer didn't exist, Yang didn't doubt she had tried to keep her presence in Vale a secret from them. She wasn't sure why, though. Summer's parents were good people, and were definitely not the type of people to simply stop caring about someone. Just like everyone on Patch, they were the kind of people that saw you as family for life, and if they'd let Raven live with them, then they almost certainly had felt like that about her too. So the fact Raven didn't want them to know so badly was more than a little confusing. Did she really want so little to do with her old life? "You okay?" she asked once she was out of the shop, Raven already straddling her bike and pulling her helmet free from the handlebars. "Yes." Yang couldn't help but feel a little sad that the short, sharp tone of the woman's voice was back, especially after having been so happy all day. I just want to leave. Knowing better than to argue and risk souring the woman's mood more, Yang nodded. Sure. Pulling her own helmet free and straddling her bike, she looked over at her birth mother and let out a small sigh. She could already tell the happy-go-lucky Raven she had been enjoying the day with was gone, and that barring some kind of miracle, wouldn't be returning. Nevertheless, she was determined to at least try to enjoy the rest of the day together, so revved up her bike and gave the woman a thumbs up. If they were done with the deliveries early, then maybe she would take them to a nice tea place. As stupid as it was, the underground parking garage of Compass Tower was quickly becoming one of Yang's favorite parts of the entire structure, and not for the reason many would think. It had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that she could openly examine and take in the numerous other sports cars that were parked there, nor that it was a safe place to store her precious bike, or even that the large, underground cavern allowed the steady purring of Bumblebee to surround her. No, the reason she loved it so much was the singular door that she could see right in front of her. As small as it was, that door had offered her more reprieve over the last month than pretty much anywhere in Vale due to it leading directly into the main entryway of the apartment building. It was because of that door in particular that she was able to avoid the mass of paparazzi that had been waiting outside with yet more questions about her time in the White Fan, just as they had been when she and Raven arrived back from Patch, and when they had arrived at the tea house. It was the same everywhere she went, and it was definitely beginning to get more than tiring. Thankfully though, since none of them had access to the parking garage and security guards cracking down on the press entering the building, it meant she didn't have to put up with any more questions for the rest of the day. So letting out a happy sigh, she finally turned off her bike and waited for the last of the vibrations to die down before getting off and making her way towards the beloved door. Thankfully, the afternoon had not been as bad as she had thought it would be. Despite being very quiet as they had finished the deliveries, Raven had quickly lightened up when they got to the tea house. Apparently an hour spent trying different types of tea from all over the world was one of the few miracles in the world that could cheer the woman up, and Yang had even bought a box of the ones the woman liked the most for the apartment. Eventually though, the woman had left for a meeting with her parole officer, and Yang had decided to return to the apartment to make herself something to eat and go over a previous test paper. So pushing her way into the atrium and heading straight for the elevators, since Yatsu wasn't on duty, and swiping her card against the reader, she slumped against the side and reached up to put her hair into a ponytail. While she loved her hair, it was undeniable that the sheer uncontrollable mass got in the way while cooking, and hair in food was never good. However, the second the elevator stopped, and she stepped out into the apartment and dropped the box of tea on the table, she froze at the sight of a pair of black shoes. They were definitely not Weiss or Blake's, and they were far too normal looking to be Ruby's, and as far as she knew, they were the only other people with keycards. "Hello?" she called cautiously, though quickly shook her head at her stupidity. No thief would be able to get past security, and they certainly wouldn't take off their shoes. "Who's here?" There was no reply, so she stepped further into the room and glanced around for the visitor. It didn't take long though, as she soon found herself locking eyes with a pair of light blue eyes that were watching her with interest from above. "Oh, hey." She smiled up at Whitley and returned to sorting out her hair. "You could have answered, you know, and miss out on the chance to watch your genius-level detective skills at work," he replied boredly, crossing his arms on the balcony. "Ha," she replied sarcastically. "How'd you get in here anyway?" "Weiss gave me a keycard," he shrugged. "She told me I could use this place if I ever wanted to." "Oh, right." She vaguely recalled Weiss mentioning that after the party. "Well, I'm about to make some food. You hungry?" Again, he didn't reply straight away, merely choosing to look at her for a few seconds. Eventually though, without bothering to say anything, he gave a small nod and walked away. From the few times she had talked with him, she knew it wasn't uncommon for the boy to be distant, but he usually had a lot more pompousness to his personality than he was currently showing, and rarely missed a chance to play games with people, though she supposed that should hardly be a surprise. If he was hiding out in the apartment instead of relaxing in his mansion, then clearly something had happened at home that caused him to leave. "Tacos it is then," she muttered to herself and moved towards the kitchen. Originally she had intended the ground beef in the refrigerator to be used for something a little more substantial than tacos, maybe a casserole or a lasagna. Both of those would take a few hours to make. And having practically raised a 14-year-old before, she knew that was far too long a wait. Besides, the boys seemed to enjoy quick and easy food, and she could always buy some more meat. So, pulling out a few pans and dishes from the cupboard, and she quickly went about preparing the food. Thankfully, it didn't take long as her own stomach was starting to growl from the delicious smell of cooking meat filling the apartment, and within 30 minutes, she was plating up the food and heading up the stairs to the mostly unused living room. Walking down the small hallways and hearing the quiet sounds of the television, she saw the boy sitting on the couch with a book in his hand and plenty more laid out on the table in front of him. Just like when Weiss studied, there was far more in front of him than should ever be necessary. "Here you go," she said, placing the plate down on the table in the only open space. "I even over-seasoned them a little for you." Not bothering to lower his book, Whitley glanced at the plate of food and raised an eyebrow. "And here I was thinking you were a chef." "Shush," she laughed, tapping his thigh with her foot and causing him to move over a little. "Just try one. If I get food poisoning, then I will sue you." He scowled, reaching out cautiously to pick up a taco and inspect it. "Sue away." She grinned confidently and sat down, crossing her legs and turning to face him. With a shake of his head, the boy took a small, testing bite of the food, and Yang waited with bated breath despite knowing what the outcome would be. Sure enough, a couple of seconds later, he took another much larger bite, and then another. "It's good," he said finally after having eaten half of the taco. "Wow, an actual compliment." Yang recoiled slightly, genuinely taken aback, though she quickly took it in stride and gave him a warm smile. "I'm glad you like them." Reaching out, she grabbed one for herself and took a bite. The seasoning was a little too much for her taste, and the soft shell was a little dry due to being store-bought, but it wasn't bad. "So," she said once the boy has swallowed his mouthful, "who are you hiding from?" "What makes you think that I am hiding from anyone?" "Well, you just complimented me, your vest is tossed on the other chair, you clearly haven't eaten all day, and you live in a massive mansion, but are here for some reason." "I think you are taking my detective comment too far," he mumbled, taking another bite of his food. "Fair enough." Giving a small shrug, she leaned back on the arm of the chair. From all the conversations she'd had with Weiss at night, she knew the boy was not very fond of being pressed for information, so didn't want to pressure him to talk if he didn't feel like it. However, she was almost certain that he did and just wasn't sure how to, so kept her focus on him and continued to eat her food. There was definitely another angle she could try that had always worked with Ruby. "So how was your dad after I left?" she asked, hoping some other conversation would help him ease into it. "Furious," the boy said absent-mindedly as he continued to work on his essay. "Though that is hardly unexpected considering the way that you talked to him." "He didn't take it out on you, did he?" "He spent most of the night in his office." Whitley paused for a moment, his pen stopping at scratching as his eyes clouded over. It only lasted a moment though, and he continued. "Willow spoke to him according to my staff though. I hope she's all right." "Apparently so," he said with a little annoyance in his voice. "If her frustrating continued attempts to bond are any indication." "And I'm guessing that's why you're here?" she asked with a smirk, his eyes filling with surprise, as he turned to look at her and realized what had just happened. "Detective Yang strikes again. Maybe I should have just ignored you when you came in," he mumbled to himself again, causing Yang to laugh slightly. "Sorry, I couldn't resist." She leaned forward and put a hand on his shoulder, looking him in the eye as she talked to him. "But seriously, if you want to talk, then I'm here for you." For a few moments, Whitley simply stared at her, his blue eyes peering into her soul, as they usually did in search of lies and deceit. But she knew he would find none. As much as Yang loved her girlfriend, she understood why Whitley couldn't go to her regarding issues with Willow. As much as their relationship had improved, Weiss was still someone who Whitley was learning to forgive, and someone who still adored her mother after everything that had happened. Yang also knew she had been a little too forceful in trying to get Whitley to give the woman another chance. But Yang wasn't going to be like that. She knew all too well what Whitley was feeling because she had felt it herself. The hesitation of having someone try to come back into your life, the uncertainty of whether that person deserved another chance or not, and if you gave them that chance would they just waste it and leave again. They were all things she had felt when she had first found out about Raven, and some of them were worries she still had, but at least she had Blake and Weiss to talk about those feelings with, while Whitley had nobody. "She just refuses to leave me alone," he sighed, as he returned to his work. With a satisfied smile to herself, Yang let go of his shoulder and returned to leaning against the arm, her attention still remaining on him. "No matter where I go, she is there, skulking around every corner, and trying to get me to talk to her. It's annoying. She could certainly see how that would be annoying. She had been lucky so far in that Raven had always allowed her room to think and reach out on her own terms. Of course, there were times when Raven made the first move and invited her to spend the day together, like she had today, but most of the time Yang was the one calling her. And that space to work out how she felt about the relationship had worked wonders in making her more comfortable with everything. She's trying to show you she's there for you, Yang reasoned with a slight shrug. But I can see how she might be overdoing it. Have you told her to back off? Of course I have, he growled. It does nothing to deter her. I spent the entirety of the afternoon with her trying to converse with me about video games. So that's what she wanted the book for, Yang thought to herself. Well, at least she's trying to take an interest in what you like. I would rather she not, he grumbled. Yang doubted that. Though she had only had a few interactions with the boy, he was very obviously someone who was more than capable of shutting down something without much effort. So if the woman's attempts at bonding were really unwelcome, then there was no doubt that he would have done so already. Or are you worried she'll let you down again? She asked casually, taking a bite of her food and not trying to sound like he was obligated to reply. That's the one thing she has done my entire life. He scowled bitterly. Why should I believe this time will be any different? Except this time she is trying, Yang reasoned again. Unfortunately, all that succeeded in doing was causing a scowl to be aimed in her direction. Look, I'm not saying you don't have a good reason to be worried, because you do. But you've got to ask yourself if missing out on a potentially good relationship with a mother who is trying to get to know you is worth saving yourself from a little pain in the future? Once again, the boy remained quiet as his eyes fell back to his work, but his pen didn't move. Knowing he was thinking over her words, she stood up and snatched the remote to change the channel. Flicking away from the news, where she was sure her face would appear within minutes, she switched to the second input and walked over to the cabinet where the gaming console was stored. What if she does, though? She heard from behind her, Whitley's voice quieter and holding more emotion than she had ever heard from the boy as he stared blankly at his notepad. Let me down again. Then that's her fault, she replied effortlessly, pulling out 2 controllers from the cabinet. You're a good kid, Whitley. A little shit sometimes, sure, but someone that your mom should consider herself lucky to have as a son. I know she's been through a rough time too, but if you give her a chance and she wastes it, then shame on her. Offering the boy a smile and walking back over, she ruffled his hair and sat back down beside him. Offering out one of the controllers, he tentatively took it. Now, you came here to relax. She grinned and powered the console on. And since I very much intend to be the cooler sister one day, it's time to show you some real games, not just the indie stuff that Oscar's addicted to. What is it? He asked curiously. Grim Hunter, she said with more emphasis than was necessary. Just me, you, and 50 minutes to take down a big, ugly monster with super over-the-top weapons. Trust me, you'll love it. Looking at the screen curiously as it loaded up to show a huge, black, serpentine dragon rising from the water and 4 hunters surrounding it, he gave his head a small nod and powered his controller on. We'll see, he mumbled, putting his notepad aside. And thank you, for listening. Glancing to her side, she gave the boy a warm smile and bumped him lightly with her shoulder. Anytime, bro. Seeing his eyes roll and letting out a short laugh, she loaded up the game and selected her usual brawler class. As it loaded in, she reached out and grabbed 2 tacos, handing one to Whitley before settling back in to play the game.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.